All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Searching the Sacred. I know that some of you aren't listening to this or watching this in the morning, but we record at 9 a.m. on Monday mornings. And so we are glad that you are joining us for Searching the Sacred, Jason, Steph, and Lisa, as always. And we are in a series this season, season 10, where we are looking at different gardens. So far, we've talked a couple of times about the Garden of Eden. We also talked about the third oracle of Balaam, which dealt with Israel being blessed as a garden by a river, which was a really beautiful conversation. So if you missed that, please go back and check out the YouTube channel or the podcast. Yeah, for all you podcast people out there, we do now have a YouTube page. So you should check out Searching the Sacred on YouTube if you want to see all of our lovely faces at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Monday. So we are so glad that you are joining us, and we are doing episode 4 of this season, and we are looking at 1 Kings chapter 21. Lisa, take it away.
Okay, I'm going to read from the NRSV translation, and we're going to go through verse 16. So it's a little bit longer than normal, so buckle up. And we debated on how we were going to pronounce this person's name, as you always can do. You can make things up or you just wing it. But we're going to go with the English translation of Naboth. And it's about their vineyard. So later the following events took place. Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard in Jezreel, beside the palace of King Ahab of Samaria. And Ahab said to Naboth, "Give me your vineyard, so that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it is near my house. I will give you a better vineyard for it. Or, if it seems good to you, I will give you its value in money." But Naboth said to Ahab, "The Lord forbid that I should give you my ancestral inheritance." Ahab went home resentful and sullen because of what Naboth the Jezreelite had said to him. For he had said, "I will not give you my ancestral inheritance." He lay down on his bed, turned away his face, and would not eat. His wife Jezebel came to him and said, "Why are you so depressed that you will not eat?" He said to her, "Because I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite and said to him, 'Give me your vineyard for money, or else if you prefer, I will give you another vineyard for it.' But he answered, 'I will not give you my vineyard.'" His wife Jezebel said to him, "Do you now govern Israel? Get up, eat some food, and be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of the Naboth the Jezreelite." There is a lot of Naboth the Jezreelite in this passage. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with his seal. She sent the letters to the elders and the nobles who lived with Naboth in his city. She wrote in the letters, "Proclaim a fast and seat Naboth at the head of the assembly. Seat 2 scoundrels opposite him and have them bring a charge against him, saying, 'You have cursed God and the king.' Then take him out and stone him to death." The men of his city, the elders, and the nobles who lived in the city did as Jezebel had sent word to them, just as it was written in the letters that she had sent to them. They proclaimed a fast and seated Naboth at the head of the assembly. The 2 scoundrels came in and sat opposite to him, and the scoundrels brought a charge against Naboth in the presence of the people, saying, "Naboth cursed God and the king." So they took him outside the city and stoned him to death. Then they sent to Jezebel, saying, "Naboth has been stoned. He is dead." As soon as Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned and dead, Jezebel said to Ahab, "Go, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, which he refused to give you for money, for Naboth is not alive, but dead." As soon as Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, Ahab set out to go down to the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite to take possession of it.
Hey. Thanks, Lisa.
A lot of stuff in that.
There's a lot in there. And
There's a lot of words, extra words.
There's a lot of words, and which is also, when we're talking about the way that we're reading scripture, what you reacted to out loud is worth noting about this passage, that it doesn't just call him Naboth. It keeps calling Naboth the Jezreelite, and that's unusual. Usually he would be introduced by that. He wouldn't be continually referred to as that. So that thing that tripped you up a little is a good principle when we're reading scripture, to notice when that's happening. Like, why would it keep saying that? What might be going on there? And I think that I'll just start there by giving us the framework for Naboth's name. So Naboth, or Naboth, his name means fruits. It's the plural of the word fruit. Jezreel means is Yezreel, if you're going to say it in Hebrew. Yezreel probably is how you say it, but it's God sows. So he's the fruit of God's sowing. When his name is being said together, his name really pairs with the place that he's from, and perhaps gives us this other layer to look for in the text, that Naboth is the fruit from the place where God sows. And what is happening to Naboth when Ahab is king?
I think that is such an interesting contrast between his name and what happens to him. It's almost like there's a built-in empathy we're supposed to have for him in this story.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also seeing the story as symbolic of something beyond itself, that this story isn't just about one man and that man's vineyard. It's about, who does the fruit of the land belong to? Perhaps. It's one possibility for what it's about. Because in this passage, the assumption is that the fruit of the land belongs to who?
Well, the assumption by the king is that it belongs to him.
Hey, this is close to my palace. It's a good land. I want it.
I want a vegetable garden here. Forget your vineyard, which is
Mhm.
really interesting too, because vineyards grow over like decades and potentially centuries, whereas like a vegetable garden gets replanted every year. And so when you're saying I'm gonna dig up your vineyard and replace it with a vegetable garden, that just feels mean.
Well, and it's also, I would say, vegetable garden is one possibility. It's a garden. It's Hayarak, Gan Hayarak, so garden of herbs or of green. The reason that matters is because in Deuteronomy 11, that was the very phrase used for what grew in Egypt. In Egypt, the land from where you came, you sowed seed and watered it as a gan yaharak, a garden of herbs or greens. That's the only other place that it's a garden like this, is he wants to uproot Naboth's garden and plant the kind of garden they had in Egypt when they were slaves in Egypt.
So it's even more of a slap in the face than just a vegetable garden. And it's
Well,
even more symbolic.
Yeah, I think there's just probably a lot more symbolism than meets the eye in this story if we just slow down and say, what is this story telling us about power, about oppression, about politics, and how gardens reflect something about all of that? There was a type of garden that existed when the people were living in the narrow place in Egypt. There was food. It was a terrible place of oppression, and there was food, and it's described as a garden of herbs. But the way you have the garden of herbs is through a system of oppression. And so they're supposed to have this different way of living in this land, where it's the land of milk and honey, where it's a place where you harvest your vineyard. There's so many laws laid out in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. When you harvest your vineyard, when you harvest your olive trees, when you harvest your fields, leave some for the poor and the widows and the orphans. Like this, you're supposed to live in this land differently than that land where you were oppressed. And now we have a king stealing someone's vineyard to plant the exact kind of garden that existed in the place of oppression.
Wow.
Lisa, what are you thinking about?
I was thinking about the ancestral inheritance language.
Yeah.
It's a little different than how things are usually talked about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, his reasoning for not giving it up. Because at first, this is part of why it was helpful, I think, or it will have been important to read the whole thing, is to notice the progression of what's happening. Is that at first, Ahab isn't just going to steal it. he offers Naboth money and says, like, give me this land. It's close to my palace, and I want to plant this kind of garden close to my palace. And Naboth's like, I can't give you my ancestral land for the sake of your garden, even if you give me money. And then Jezebel has this plot where they steal it. But the first offer could be considered fair, perhaps. But Naboth,
also, it could be considered fair, but it's not in keeping with kind of the expectations of what it means to be an Israelite.
okay, say more.
Well, if we go back into, I don't even know what, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, something in there, Numbers, right? Like, there was every 7 years, every 50 years, year Jubilee, like the land was supposed to be returned to its original families. And it was that way you couldn't have this excess of wealth had by one family over another. Even if, one family goes through a time of hardship, the crop doesn't come in, they lose out on all their profit margin or whatever, and they end up like saying, okay, we're going to sell off our land to this neighbor so that we can utilize their resources. We'll work on our own land, but we'll be basically indentured servants to them. And then in 7 years, we'll the debt will be forgiven and we'll get our land back. Or, heaven forbid, it doesn't go away in 7 years. And then in 50 years, we're supposed to get it back because it's supposed to be returned so that there's a redistribution of wealth so that you don't create these insane hierarchies of the haves and the have-nots. And so this idea of ancestral land is really tied to the equality and the equity that should be built into this community, but has obviously been dissolved over hundreds of years and generations of kings doing whatever they want and taking people and utilizing them for their own means and building palaces and temples and all kinds of things. And here we just have another continuation of that trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's worth noting that it's not just about it being his land and I don't want to. There's a connection to his ancestors.
Yeah.
And that it reminds me of, this is not actually that far-fetched for us to understand in terms of our history. It's set up differently in the US, I guess I would say. But like, I think about my family, like growing up in a family that has farmland and farms, there's very much conversation around family farmland. Like, there's
Mm-hmm.
generations, there's a history to it. I don't know that there would be so much that they wouldn't sell ever. But there are some folks, like we see that all over the place. Like, their communities literally build around farmers and their farmlands, and essentially it almost extinguished them just by the building of the houses around them.
Mm-hmm.
And then if we look back a little bit to like Rondo in St. Paul and the story of how Interstate 94 came through and where it was decided to go, like, power just kind of wants what it wants and expects to have what it wants without being told no.
Mm. Ooh, say that again, the exact way you just said it, if you can.
Well, let's just rewind the tape.
Power wants what it wants.
Like, power wants what it wants, and it doesn't want to hear no. No is not the option for power.
So, like, you're tying into several places of history that we can understand in the United States, and we can say, like, okay, this was a different time period in a different place, but how are there themes of power that remain the same? So when settlers first came here, how did they look at indigenous populations and say, your land is in a spot that is close to where I have settled. I need it. I will take it. I will offer you a treaty, right? And often it did start with some sort of offer and ended in some sort of violence. That's part of the soil that this country was built on. And it's a part of the soil that continues with things like eminent domain and highways, where people are, oh, we need to put a highway where your land is. Doesn't matter if it's been in your family for generations. Doesn't matter if it's a neighborhood that's been an established good neighborhood for your community. This is where the highway needs to go. And there's a way that you can sort of see why it feels logical to the people in power. And you can feel the injustice
Mm-hmm.
to those who have land being taken, which I think the logic piece of this is sort of unique. He's not just taking it to take it. It's close to his palace. In his mind, this feels like a logical choice. Like it starts in that space of like, well, your land is really close to my palace, and then there's a garden I want to build. Like you can kind of hear the justification in his mind.
Except that he also lays in bed and doesn't.
Yeah, totally.
Like there's this, like it's a very strange, like.
Well, and I think there's still some symbolism here too of like, as we think about this as a story about power and how the garden is symbolizing power, let's also like zoom out to the northern kingdom of Israel and the power dynamics of this time period. So like Ahab and Jezebel, many of our listeners will be familiar with them from flannel graphs or whatever, even women being called Jezebels when they are being a particular way.
I have actually been called that by a
Okay.
pastor's wife. Just to note.
Just to note, on our very own podcast, we have a woman who's been called a Jezebel, which means that sometimes because we know them in that context, we can actually over-vilify them and lose the humanity of what's happening in the northern kingdom of Israel at this point. So really not that many, a couple generations before, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom split in Israel, and they split because the descendant of Solomon was going to tax the people again after Solomon taxed the people, and a bunch of the tribes said, we don't trust a descendant of David to be king. And there's a civil war, they revolt, and it leads to this split where there's a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah. And you can actually feel like the northern kingdom is doing that because they're like, "This, you guys we're not doing this right, and we don't trust you. We're going to set up something new," and they split. That split geographically, those northern tribes are where the wheat fields are. It is the breadbasket of that particular part of the world. And so as that northern kingdom is trying to reestablish themselves after civil war, set up a new capital, figure out new things, they use the resources they have, which is the wheat. And I feel like this time period of the Bible, for anybody who plays Settlers of Catan, it absolutely it's the game. Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, has the wheat. Jezebel is a Phoenician princess. Phoenicia has the wood, and they also have tend to have alliances with like the Edomite, like places to the east, who has the sheep. Like literally we have wood, sheep, and grain and wheat as a part of like the alliances that are happening. Ahab is actually the first king to really create peace for the people because he has built these alliances and used their resources to bring peace and prosperity to the northern tribes after years of not having peace and prosperity. The people, by and large, would not have seen him as a bad king. He's not following Yahweh. He's not a religious king, but politically, he's doing smart things that are bringing peace and prosperity to the people at large. And how does that then affect how we see his actions and how we see Elijah talking to him? If we think about him as a good king politically, who's not following God and but is also then being the kind of king that many kings have been in the history of the world. Oh, this resource. So now connecting it to him not eating. What he's not eating is very specifically, it says he's not eating bread. Lechem. That is the fruit of the land. Like the wealth that he has used, that he's accumulated, is from wheat, and he's not eating the thing that wheat makes. So we still have this play going on where it's like what is happening to the fruit of the land. Naboth is the fruit that God sows. Bread is made from the produce of the northern kingdom, where all of Ahab's power has come from, and he's not eating that, and he wants what Naboth has. Did that make sense? Did that roundabout and anything need more explanation?
No, it's a really helpful kind of backdrop of like where we find ourselves, and it raises a lot of questions around, what makes a good king. The Bible seems to have a fairly specific expectation of do they follow Yahweh or not? And that's what kind of determines goodness versus badness. The Bible doesn't seem to be too worried about like who's more politically savvy than the other. Even though I think that is something that we have to like recognize, that being politically savvy is something that could have been very well respected for by the people, which is actually interesting, because if the goal is for them to be connected to Yahweh, and yet we have a king who's successful politically who's moving them away from Yahweh, that's actually even more dangerous than just a really, if you don't like Yahweh and you're really bad politically, it's easy for the people to be like, well, this is dumb. But if you're really good politically and you're leading the people away from Yahweh, that's a real problem, right? Not to make a modern day contrast, but it's kind of like when the economy is really good from 2016 to 2019, and everybody thinks that the president at the time is the bee's knees, and suddenly all of the pro-lifers are like turning him into Jesus, and it's actually further away from generous Christianity, and it's more down the road of bigotry. But because our pocketbooks got full, we were okay with it. Okay, I'm going to get myself into more trouble here, but you know what I'm saying.
Well, I think anytime we mix the role of a king to lead people closer to a religious source, we probably have a problem. It's the problem with kings. It's the problem with any type of leadership. And quite honestly, as much as it as difficult as it is, we can see like we could line this up with either set of politics and beliefs.
Yeah.
And we can enter into this story and go, look, see, this is what we're saying. Because however you see it, everybody sees it through a lens of their own meaning making. And I think what makes it, there's a part of me that like reads the story and I'm like, well, of course this is what happens. This is what happens. This is what power does. In any way, like anybody who's scrambling to keep power, I don't care what political side you line up with, there's a way that you're wanting to continue to have power to make choices and make decisions. And some things are more critical because it involves people's lives.
Yeah.
And some things are not as critical because it's not about lives per se. But I don't know. Like I think the swirl of politics gets more and more complicated because I don't want to end up in the space of like complete divisiveness all the time.
Yeah.
Because I think
Which is, I think that's a part of seeing Ahab as like good politically, is like as much is, can we keep ourselves from othering people in the Bible as a way of finding how we're doing that here? Like, it's not like all the kings were good. But part of what led to this was that David and Solomon had problematic things that passed on to their children and grandchildren. That was a part of what led to all of this. You were going to say more, Lisa. Sorry.
Well, I was thinking about, so like Ahab's name is kind of like linked to like my father's brother. So like, but interestingly, that really is the patriarchy. Like my father and my father's brothers are like, that is the patriarchy. And it's interesting that Jezebel is like, there is this interesting male-female dynamic that's happening. I'm not a super big fan of villainization of women in the Bible, but it's also what happens. So here we are. But like Jezebel is not wrong to point out, you have all the power you want. What's your problem?
Yeah.
She's not wrong. And like what it's just interesting that like she's the one that comes up with the plan of like, go just do the damn thing. Because he's miserable. Like wanting to alleviate his uncomfortable whining sadness about not having a garden. An additional garden. Because he sure in the hell has gardens. Like he's a king. Like, I mean,
he doesn't need this.
No.
But something in him does, and feels like There's a way that one of the ways I'm thinking about Jezebel right now is that she's like, her name means exalted of Baal.
Mhm.
So she's definitely a bit of a vilified woman, but connected then to this false god of Baal. Except that there's also a way that Baal is a more generic false god name. Like, it's sort of, yes, it's about a particular god, but it's also, Baal is just used a lot in the Bible as sort of any god you're following that's not the God of Israel, right? And there's a way that I feel like she's also, again, sort of a name that is symbolic and honest of like, okay, you are trying to like pretend here that you are being forthright and good, like in offering this, like, but like you have a choice to, like, if you want it, take it. There is a way that's just symbolic of like what it is to follow a Baal, like a
Mhm.
like if you were looking for a god of power, that god of power just takes. Are you going to be what are you going to follow that god, or are you going to follow the god? It's not like you're really following the God of Israel. So just be honest about the kind of king you are and just take the land. Because that's the kind of king you are. That's what you've married into. That's the kind of alliances you make. Like, be that kind of king. Like she's sort of calling him to honesty because his despair is a little bit false.
Yeah.
The other thing I'm thinking, I'm making it really relatable to me right now. Like, this is overly personalized because I think the communal responsibility is a really important thing, but I'm trying to like keep it real and not villainize Ahab.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking about being an Enneagram 4, and that there is this place that Enneagram 4s trip on of having a comparing mind, and that the comparing mind really makes you see things inaccurately about yourself and about other people. And it creates this. So there's this thing where he looks at Naboth and he's like, oh man, your vineyard looks really good. It's really close to my palace. I'd really like to plant something there. And as soon as that is in his mind, he can no longer be content with what he has. Like, the not eating the bread to me feels like he is missing out on eating the produce that already exists from what he already has. It's a very particular thing to not eat bread. And how does comparison make us miss the mark on what we already have? Because there's something that we see that we want that we don't have, that not only do we then feel sad about that, but we stop eating what we do have. And it makes us long for that other thing even more.
I mean, this is why coveting is one of the 10 commandments about how to live in healthy relationship, right? Like, because this is what it can do to a person, is it not only makes them want the other person's stuff, but you lose appreciation for what you already have and the contentment that you can live in with the, the good that's already yours.
Mhm.
But I think that's a really important part to bring up because, yeah, it's clear he's lost sight of the plot, right? Like, he's completely fixated on this thing and it's taking over his whole world. I mean, it just sounds like a petulant little child. I mean, you know how you like watch uh movies and shows and they have these little whiny like boy kings who just get whatever they want. When they don't get the thing they want, they like wreak havoc until someone gives them what they want. That's just kind of what it reminds me of, is this like, I want this new shiny thing, and when I don't get it, I'm gonna pout and not like appreciate the fact that I'm like literally the king and have everything I want and don't actually need this thing. And so I'm gonna whine until mommy comes along and says, well, let's figure out a cute way to get it for you. And and then we cause a whole bunch of havoc, but then, hey, at the end we get the vineyard, so it's all good. And yeah, it's just such a, it's hard for me to like hear that he's a good king. I get the political side of it and like making alliances, but there's so much that he seems to be doing that directly goes against the expectations of a king that are laid out in the law, and that it's just kind of like, this isn't even close to what is meant to be a model for Israel to follow. This is the opposite of that.
Well, it's that's why the best language I could come up with is a good king politically.
Right.
To say like there is a framework with which you could say he is leading well because he has led them to a time of peace and prosperity. So if that's your framework for what a good king looks like, he would be a good king. There is peace and prosperity under Ahab.
I
Okay,
feel like that's
but
what we look at for almost all presidents. I mean, if we're going
Right.
to talk about a good president, we're going to look at peace and prosperity.
Right. How do you the question that you're actually asking a question that's really important, Jason, for like how we would translate a story like this to the modern world is what do we think makes a good leader, a good king, a good president? If peace and prosperity is the definition of it, Ahab is good. But this is also the cost of peace and prosperity is a king who does stuff like he steals Naboth's vineyard because he wants it. There's a like that. Is it truly good if that's the kind of leader he is, even if there's peace and prosperity for most of the people?
okay, can I say something that's probably not the most pro-capitalist, pro-Western?
I mean, you've already gotten political in this episode, and we're talking about
No, I
kings, so
know.
it probably gets us political. But you decide the cost to your
Okay,
life, Jason.
no, I'm not worried. I'm not worried about that at all. Is prosperity really the goal? Like, is that really meant to be the goal? I don't think it's actually, because honestly, I don't think it's the goal. I think the goal is to be content, to live harmoniously, to be good stewards of the land, to create opportunity for the least of these that are in your midst, whether it's the widow, the orphan, the alien. Um, I don't I don't get anything from the law and those first kind of, here's what it means to like inhabit I don't get anything from that it's like, hey, conquer and be the biggest, baddest, dude on the block and kick everybody's ass and have the biggest army and have the most wealth and make all the best alliances that only benefit you and not the other person. Like, I don't get any of that, like, in the law. Like, it's literally like, hey, you're going to inhabit this land and you're going to do it humbly. You're going to do it like thoughtfully. You're going to be a good neighbor because you're going to get blessed so that you can not dominate everyone else, but so that you can bless everyone else. Like, at some level, it's almost like, don't be a threat. Like, don't let like power and a pursuit of wealth be your ultimate goal, because then you're just going to be threatening to everybody. And then that's going to create a whole different set of problems, and you're going to need a bigger army, and you're going to need more wealth, you're going to need political alliances, and it's just going to go to like hell in a handbasket real fast, which is exactly what happens, and it's what exactly has been happening throughout every century of the entire history of the world. And I feel like what the Bible is trying to do for us is say there's a different way to be human, and it's not this. And I don't think America is a great example, because we are about having the biggest military on the planet. We are about having the best economy on the planet. We are about having the most upward mobility for our citizens and residents on the planet. We are about having people join our country as long as they can benefit us the most, right? Like, we're going to let the scientists in, but we're not going to let in the, poor immigrants, except, maybe here and there a little bit. Like, we got to control that and like make sure we kick most of them out. Like, we are, yes, the idea of prosperity, I get why people want it. I want it too, but I don't think I should. Like, it does, it just perpetuates the cycle of violence ultimately. That's what it'll end up coming down to.
Mhm. It makes me think about the way that this passage connects into Deuteronomy 11 and this conversation where we're here because we're talking about gardens, right? And there's this conversation, there's a thread that has gone from the Garden of Eden into Genesis 13, into Deuteronomy 11, into here, of what is the source of water for the garden? So which I think has to do with the type of prosperity we're talking about. So stick with me here for a second. In Genesis 13, when Lot and Abram are splitting, Abram gives Lot the ability to like look out at the land and choose what he wants. And he looks at this particular place and it reminds him of a well-watered garden like the land of Egypt. And so we have there the first comparison of the land of Egypt being like the Garden of Eden. And he compares it like the Garden of Eden, like Egypt. And he ties those two together, which should be our first flag in scripture of, do I know the difference between the Garden of Eden and the gardens of Egypt? What is the difference there? When we're in Deuteronomy 11, that's where we have this same phrase that Ahab is using about wanting to make Naboth's vineyard into a garden of herbs or a garden of green. And in Deuteronomy 11, that's what the gardens of Egypt were referred to as. And so as I'm looking at Deuteronomy 11, what I'm noticing is this contrast that's set up where in Deuteronomy 11:12, for the land where you go to possess it, it is not as the land of Egypt from where you came, where you sowed your seed and watered it with your foot as a garden of herbs. There's this idea of like watering it with your foot, like when you make the land produce. That's what I hear. Like it's not where you came from, where you make the land produce. The land where you're going, God cares for it. It's a land of hills and valleys that drinks the rain of heaven. And so I'm curious about this contrast being developed between Naboth's vineyard, which is like this plate, like a vineyard isn't I don't know if any of this is making sense outside of my head. It's like, what's the cost of the prosperity? What's the, like, I'm making the land produce something. That's where you came from. And that's the kind of garden Ahab's trying to build. Vineyards are set up in this land of milk and honey that the Lord waters. Vineyards are one of the things set up to be a place of generosity, which is different. And so I'm thinking about like, I can't find the words for it. There's something about the language of this particular type of garden that Ahab is wanting to plant in Naboth's vineyard is described as a garden that was watered with your foot. That feels like something to me. That feels like a trampling of the land. It feels like things like modern farming practices where you make the land produce corn and corn and corn and corn and end up actually creating drought because it hasn't been rotated, it hasn't been cared for well, right? Like there's a way of like making a land produce that's connected to the kind of prosperity you're talking about, Jason, that feels connected to the kind of garden Ahab wants to build, like force it, push it.
Maximize it.
Well, it's how we are. I mean, we import a lot of stuff so that we can have what we want when we want it all year round.
Yes.
Right. Like that's, I mean, we live I want my bananas at the grocery store.
I want bananas year round. It's really nice to have bananas year round.
I like some mango, a lot of strawberries. Like we have a particular, and that costs something. We're not close to it because that is certainly not in our next door yard. It's being imported. It's like it makes you feel better when you're distanced from it. You don't have to think about it. Mm-hmm. But like the reality is, even in this story, is by planting a garden that needs to be watered and needs to be tended a little differently, you're forcing it. There's going to be labor and people that are impacted by this decision to have what he wants. But I also was thinking about like this language of, my Bible says scoundrels in multiple translations, but when I look it up in the tools, it's really worthless. So like to see two humans as worthless, and like that's who's asked to like come against Naboth. It's not two citizens, not two people. Like any two people could offer up an accusation. But why choose two people that you're going to identify as worthless
Mm.
to do that work? Like, it's so problematic for me. Just that there's even like that's the language.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, it feels, yeah, again, if we keep all of this as like a garden, there's a way that when we are moving forward from the Garden of Eden in Genesis 2 and 3, and we're looking at these gardens in scriptures, there's this deeper question of how are we using land? How are we using power? What are we pushing for? What are we cultivating? How are we seeing other people? That here in this story about a garden, you're seeing all of these other aspects of like how they're seeing each other, how people are being seen, how power is being used. This is not Eden. This is not a place of delight. This is not a place of relational harmony.
Well, as much as we don't, I mean, we don't think of land the same way as the people in the text do for the most part, but it is an interesting thing to think about what happens when we do,
Mhm.
like how we see it and how we treat people with it. And um I don't know, there's a way of looking at your home and like where you live as like, I worked for this, I did this, this is mine. And there's another way of looking at it and being like so grateful for the opportunities. And I can't quite believe that I can call this house my home and we get to live here and do life here. And I want to share it with other people. Um, and there's an idea we have. Um, we just have this idea that we'll never lose it. Like I bought it, my land.
Mhm.
And without the consideration even of like what nature can do. Like I think right now we're looking at some of that with the flooding and hurricanes and how quickly things can be wiped away and
Mhm.
changed. And in other countries, I mean, looking at people who are waking up today and they can't be home or they're told to leave their home for safety. There's a lot of things that we have pushed out from our collective memories and outside of our collective, like even imaginations of what can happen. We just assume that will never be us.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
And so we live in a way that it will never be us.
Mhm.
And I think that's really dangerous. And it begins that space of where everybody is in like we other really quickly and we again, I don't know, like there's just not it's not conducive to community.
Mhm.
It's conducive to like winner takes all.
Mhm.
Mm.
And
Which
I think in the US we just assume we're always the winner. We're gonna be the winner and take it all the time.
I think that there's a way we've talked about this before on the podcast too, but like in being really careful when we're talking about these places that do have modern geographic equivalents, that we're actually thinking about them according to their names more than their geography. And like this garden that is the type of garden that takes this trampling of the foot, this forcing of the land, that's the garden of the narrow place. We're talking about a garden where like God is watering it and where it's harvested in a way that's for all. That's the garden of those who wrestle with God and with humans and are able. And so, how can we make space for the wrestling, for the kind of abundance that's provided versus forced, and about us, not just about me, because that land then of those who wrestle with God and humans are able. Part of the wrestling is to harvest it in a way that's for all. That's not just for me. That's for something beyond. And that's really the inheritance. Like when we're thinking about Naboth's name, is he's the fruit of what God sows. And he's got a vineyard, which is one of the symbolic places in the land that is symbolic of the abundance and the abundance being shared. And he doesn't want to give up that inheritance. There's a way he's like a holdout of doing it all differently.
Mm-hmm.
And that holdout ends up stoned. And doesn't that feel true? when we try to be like, no, I don't want to do things the way the power of the time is doing things. I want to hold out. I'm not going to be the person who buys bananas at the grocery store, whatever, right? Honestly, I can't hold out. I will not pretend that I don't shop at Amazon. I absolutely shop at Amazon. Do I want to be a person who doesn't shop at Amazon? Yes. Can I get myself to be a person who doesn't shop at Amazon? No. Because I want what I want when I want it. Just like that power thing that Lisa was talking about. I'm not a holdout. Naboth was a holdout. I'm not a holdout. I give in. I give in all the time to this way of being in the world that's like, oh, this is close to my palace. I want it.
Mhm.
This is where I find power. I want it. This is like, I'm not strong enough to be a holdout most of the time.
I think it's interesting that, and I like where we're taking this conversation, because we're taking it to a place where we're actually asking ourselves to wrestle with what's our posture uh in positions of power and ownership and protection of what we have and all that. I think what's interesting about a lot of the stories that we read in this time period is that they're confronting kings, and we don't get a lot of, you know, conflict between neighbors, or, how did so and so engage in the bartering system at the time, or, did so and so loan something to a neighbor and charge too high of an interest? Like, we're talking about a king who's supposed to be a model and an example to the rest of the people. And that's not to say, like, to put all of it on like presidents or like US senators or whatever, like people in political power. But there is something about, like, when the systems at play, who are controlled by very powerful people, set it up this way, there's a question about, like, what do we do? Like, sitting in my home in New Brighton with my, like, the options that I have for me to go shopping or to eat, like, yes, I could choose to go shop local. Yes, I could go find a farmer somewhere nearby and try to eat more seasonally. There are things that I can, yes, I agree. But also, like, the system is set up for this. And I'm not in charge of that system going around and around. Like, Ahab is in charge of the system. Jezebel is as close to power as humanly possible and is in charge of perpetuating the system. And so there's something about, like, being in leadership and having your hand on the system and what you choose to do with it. That is, I mean, I don't think the Bible shies away from saying that there's a higher level of accountability for those who have power and those who don't.
Well, and it's clear in this story, like, it's not just Ahab and Jezebel. Like, the letter is sent to the elders and the, like, leaders. Like, it is sent to local it's sent to other people who have a decision to make,
Yeah.
right? Like, they have more power than other folks. Obviously, more power than Naboth, and no more power than the people who are worthless. And they just join in.
Yeah.
Like, they uphold, because, like, in what they know it's false, they know it's not true, and they know what it's for, and they agree to it.
Mm.
And that is, I mean, that should be just as disturbing as, like, a king
Yeah.
and his queen doing it. Like, the
Yep.
fact that there's other folks that are on board.
Like, what do we turn a blind eye to
Mhm.
when it's what power wants, when that power has benefited us in certain ways?
Mhm.
I mean, that makes me think of, I'll be the one to bring up the prison industrial complex today, Lisa.
Go
That's
for it.
usually what you do. But like, how many goods do we have available to us at a low price because they have been a part of that system? And so, where do we
Mhm.
turn a blind eye to people getting incarcerated because it might not be in our neighborhood, so we get to ignore it, and it's a part of some of our goods being cheaper?
Mhm.
And how are we then like the people who stone Naboth and turn away? Because maybe they'll benefit from the Garden of Herbs in some way that the king has planted there. Means the king will come by. Means I'm a little closer to, I don't know. I also think about like, do they want it to not be a vineyard? Like, as I'm thinking about vineyards being so specifically a part of the instruction of how the poor were cared for, that like vineyards, wheat fields, and olive groves were the three places very specifically named and how you harvest it being important, that you leave some behind. That if Naboth is guarding the inheritance of his fathers, I'm going to assume that he was harvesting that way, where he was leaving some for the poor and the widow and the stranger. And so was this town sick of the poor, widow, and stranger coming onto Naboth's vineyard and really happy to get a fence around that and have it be a garden of the king instead.
Well, and there's rules too, like, because there's a way that, like, what's interesting is that, like, Ahab knows that when Naboth says no, because this is my inheritance, that it's a no.
Yeah.
There's a particular way that he knows that this is he can say no. Like, Naboth can say no to power and legitimately, like, the only way to remove him is to create a falsehood.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what they can't do is just say, "Get off the land."
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, it's interesting because it's not that power gets to just straight line the power. They actually are gonna lie and manipulate to get the thing to happen. It's
Mm-hmm.
not like they came out and said, "Well, we want it. We're taking it. Goodbye."
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's, like, partly in my brain, that's what happened. But
Right.
if I slow down and I think about it a little bit, no, power did not just go in and take it. They actually, like, manipulated the whole thing so that it looked like it was above board. When the reality is it wasn't. It is not yours to take.
Mm-hmm. So as we think about where we've been with gardens and Genesis 2 to Genesis 3 to Numbers 24, is that where we were last time?
Yeah.
How does this expand or tie into those threads of like gardens and what it is to be a garden or to tend a garden?
Hmm. Well, I think we're starting to see the manipulation of even the what should be a good garden. We're starting to see it be manipulated into a point of a power struggle. Whereas I feel like when you're in the Garden of Eden, it's clarity around purpose and meaning. It gives you a sense of, hey, tend this and guard this, make it fruitful, be a part of it. Um, and then it's not perfect, it's never gonna be, but you get to be a part of this and operate in it. And then we see them leave it and go out into the world, and yet they're still a people that are called, right? A garden by a living water, like by the waters, like that's the third oracle of Balaam. Like you are like a garden planted by a river. So like this is still who you are. You're one with God. You are intimate with God. God is with you. And now what we're seeing is the manipulation of it. And it's like, well, maybe we could do it this way. Maybe we could go back to the Egypt way. Maybe we could, you know, and power is going to do what power wants to do, and it's going to be this constant struggle moving forward.
I feel like I want to position myself as Naboth in the story, but I don't think that that's where I am. I think I'm in, like, not that I'm a noble person, but I do have influence and affluence,
Yeah.
and it's worth noting what I do to keep power in place. And um like, how do I bow to the pressure, or how do I harm other people through different things? Um And like, what does that require? Like, what does it? How do I live differently?
Mm-hmm.
And knowing I'm also not living in biblical times. Like it's like this both and of
Yeah.
I'm not living in this history, and I am. It is a good question to think about. How am I tending the things in my life? Am I forcing other folks to have to like live differently because of how I want to live? Yeah.
I'm really
Mm.
struck by like the Garden of Eden as compared to the Garden of Herbs or Garden of Greens. I think it's probably best like Garden of Greens, Garden of Eden, Garden of Greens. And that the Garden of Greens is not Eden. Garden of Greens is the thing that you get by your foot. Like, do I know the difference? That's what I want. We do this study in 40 Orchards where we're talking about Lot lifting his eyes. We talked about that a minute ago of like, he can't tell the difference between the Garden of Eden and the land of Egypt. And I feel like that's happening again in this other way of like, do I know the difference? In my own life, like, did Ahab think that what he was doing was okay? Because he was going to tend a garden and he was offering the person something fair for it. Like, am I Ahab is what I'm like, again, I want to be Naboth, but like, am I Ahab where I'm like, I get confused about what garden we're really talking about, what's mine to tend. And I think, well, as long as it's done fairly, it's okay. I think I don't take it as far. I hope I don't take it as far as it went, but I don't know these first few verses. When do I act like Ahab is acting and like just look at someone and be like, well, here, just take this money and then I can have the garden I want? And where am I not seeing what I'm really supposed to be tending and guarding?
So how do we wrap this up? Because we're leaving it very vague,
Oh,
and
you don't got to wrap it up.
I'm
Leave
not
it
saying we
messy.
have to. I know, but we are leaving it messy. So how do we leave it? So okay, we're maybe not wrap it up. Sorry, poor choice of words. How do we eloquently hold the mess?
I don't know that you can. I think it gets messy.
Yeah.
But you have to try. Like, part of it is just trying.
Mhm.
To pretend as if it doesn't happen feels like the most dangerous thing of all.
This has been a 40 Orchards podcast. At 40 Orchards, our mission is to create circles for all people to wrestle through biblical text so that together we can expand each other's experience of what is sacred, whole, and good. We search through the lens of sacred possibility, assuming there is more to be discovered, questioned, and applied as we listen for how God is still speaking. You can learn more about 40 Orchards and sign up for a study by going to 40, that's 40orchards.org. Our opening music is by LesFM. Our closing music is by NCR Music Vibes. Additional music is by 3 Music. Any references to books or other sources can be found in the show notes of this episode. Thank you for searching the sacred.